This is actually going to be a presentation about my experiences that I had diving the Northern Pacific and why it was such a special wreck to me, and also diving the Big Seven. So the Big Seven was actually named by me and Gary Gentile when we put on the first overnight trip off the New Jersey coast, and we used a boat called the White Star. We ran out of Cape May for 3 days, and it was a pretty spectacular trip. But these wrecks are what everybody wanted to dive when they first started diving. So I'm going to take you through a tour, starting out with the Northern Pacific, and then talking a little bit about how it was discovered, and then talking about the other wrecks that we dive off the coast. So it's kind of a intro to wreck. I call it wreck-nickel diving instead of technical diving, because when it first started out, everybody dove everything, and there was no special guarantee that you were going to get out there. It was just a matter of being able and being at the right spot at the right time. My 7th open water dive was actually on the Northern Pacific. I dove it when I was about 16, and I still remember it was pretty spectacular. I dove it on a single 72 and went down and touched the bottom and watched the other guy who was diving with me recover a porthole and come back up to the surface, and that's how I got enlightened by this. But I heard about the discovery of the Northern Pacific when I first took my basic scuba class, and this is in Washington, D.C. when I took my course in 1969. I wanted to go so bad, and when I worked for the dive shop in New Jersey, I was able to hook up with this guy. Sammy Still was the ultimate dive guy, and he was a mentor for many people that got to meet him. And he was the go-to guy to dive the Northern Pacific. It's a picture of him here. He recovered the helm from the Southern Sword. So he was already an icon in diving. He used to come to the dive shop in New Jersey on Wednesday nights for air fills. And to say that the dive shop had some special rules for his gang, after that, they kind of continued on, like no beer in the dive shop type of thing later on. It was a pretty exciting time when his group came there. But that was the guy to be with and go diving with. I finally got his invite. Northern Pacific is one of the largest wrecks off the coast, and it was a stepping stone for anybody who was going to do deeper diving. It was offshore, 40 miles offshore. It was deep. It had strong currents coming from the Delaware Bay, and there was only a couple boats going out to it. And one ran out of Indian River Inlet, the other one ran out of Cape May, and the other one, ran out of Wildwood, and that was the wild one with Captain Sammy Still. He also made runs to the Big Seven, which is all the wrecks, all the popular wrecks at that time off of Cape May. This is Phil Lindell and Sammy. Phil is an icon too in diving. If you've ever dove the Terror wreck, it was named after Phil's first dive on that wreck. He came up to the surface. They thought they were going to dive a wreck in about 110, 120 feet of water, but that was the top of the wreck. When he got down to the bottom in 170 feet of water, he came up, and he'll admit it, he was terrified. So they named the wreck the Terror wreck after that. It was exciting because Sammy took you out. A guy named Hermie Atkins was his mate. He jumped over the side with the line in his hand, swam down to the bottom, and when we were tied in, Sammy would go, "Let's go diving, boys," and everybody hit the water at the same time. In the 1960s, Don Scheibel researched with Gene de Havilland a wreck called the Jacob Jones. He thought this was a spectacular wreck, but nobody had found it and no one had dove it. So he went out and he looked for a boat captain to take him offshore to find that wreck. Now, there were only a few boats at the time that were running that distance offshore to catch fish, and he was able to hook up with a guy and go out and dive it named Dolinsky. And this is the boat that he went out with. Albert J. Dolinsky. Jim, J stands for Jim, and he named his boat the Big Jim. He found two images that they thought might be what he was looking for. One was huge and one was smaller. So Don hooked up with John Dudas. John Dudas was a legend in his time, and still to this day, he was one of the first divers to hit many different wrecks, including the Moonstone and several other wrecks that we'll talk about tonight, and recover the bell from the Moonstone, and to actually capture some pretty spectacular lobster here. When they first got there, on their first dive, they thought they were going to dive the Jacob Jones, but they found this massive wreck. Turned out to be the Northern Pacific. Northern Pacific is almost 500 feet long. It's a massive wreck. It was an Army transport, and it caught on fire, which we'll talk about later. But when they got down, they found the wreck was turtle. It was upside down, and these three gigantic propellers were sticking out from the wreck. So he knew this was not the Jacob Jones. This was the Northern Pacific. It's a picture, actually, of the fire. The Coast Guard cutter Kickapoo had to stand a mile away from it, downwind and upwind of it, because the fire was so intense, the heat from it, they could not get any closer. So this was their first discovery. Pretty exciting to find this massive wreck on the bottom. And when you see the pictures of it, you're going to be overwhelmed how big this wreck is. Jacob Jones was the greatest loss of naval life off of the Jersey coast at the time, and it was torpedoed by the U-857. The stern, I'll stand out of your way here. The wreck actually lost most of its life from the depth charges of its own vessel after they exploded when they went to the bottom. And there's still live depth charges and torpedoes on board. When you go through the wreckage, you can see these and some of the other wrecks that you'll see tonight in this slide presentation. You'll see some of the other wrecks also had some live ordnance on it. Massive, massive wreck. And if you can imagine this sitting upside down on the bottom with three propellers. Those propellers were later salvaged, but when they first touched down on it, they saw this huge wreck sitting on the bottom. It ran from Astoria to San Francisco. Astoria was a town that was named in Oregon after John Astoria, who was a real estate magnate at the time. He also was, if you understand anything about the sinking of the Titanic, he was also one of the rich people on board that went down with the sinking of the Titanic in 1912. Look at the size of the crew members compared to the size of the ship itself. So you can only imagine what John Dudas saw when he touched down on the wreck and saw this upside down wreck with these huge propellers. It must have been overwhelming. And then to go out and discover the second wreck that day, the Jacob Jones, it's a once in a lifetime experience for anybody, but to find two of these spectacular wrecks off the coast in the same day was something else. Propellers were also salvaged by the Aquanaut crew here later on. They went down and they blew off the props. Danny Brzett, who was on a dive after they blew the props off, actually recovered one of the hubs, and the hubs had Northern Pacific on it, so it positively identified the wreck by actually being able to recover that hub. And the wreck is just immense, and there's a big crack in the hull from the fire, and it's upside down, and you can easily get dissuaded and lost on this wreck, but there's a peninsula that goes out into the middle of the sand, and you swim out there underneath the wreck, and you can see portholes that are just above your head. Even to this day, there's still some portholes left there. There were over 600 portholes on this ship, so divers still recovered them. Now they're way underneath the wreckage in many cases. They'll use everything from plumber snakes to their own ingenuity and lift bags to lift up the hull pieces to get down and recover these, but there's still a lot to see. You can swim along the wreck and see portholes laying loose in the sand, which is still an obsession for many divers. You go up to the bow and it's upside down, and you swim to the top of it, and you look down the wreckage and you have this massive wreck in front of you. You feel like a fly on a dead whale. You're just so small and so insignificant. That's a tugboat. That tugboat there is 60 feet long. So you can just imagine the size of this wreck. Somewhere on the wreck is a bell. It has not been recovered. It's buried underneath the wreckage. Remember, this caught on fire, so it was an intense fire. I don't think the bell would have melted, but it could have, but it's definitely buried underneath the hull. So here's some workers painting, and again, just to give you an idea of how gigantic this wreck is, look at how they painted back then. They had scaffolds on the side, they painted by hand, and they did rows and rows of this black paint on this hull. And when it was a passenger liner running the trips from Astoria, Oregon, down to San Francisco, it was pretty ornate, but later on it was turned into an Army transport. And it was elaborately decorated. It was part of the Pacific Lines, so it was very fancy and beautiful. This is when it was turned into an Army transport. They painted a camouflage on it so that it would not be sticking out so much as a ship in the wave action for a German U-boat to come along and see it. Made 13 trips between France and Hoboken, New Jersey, bringing troops back and forth. Again, this is the camouflage color of the hull. And look at all the portholes. I mean, it's just like overwhelming, the number of portholes on there. So it made the headlines when it ran aground in Fire Island on the way into New York Harbor, and 2,973 mostly injured and sick were trapped on board the ship, and they were removed eventually, but it took some time, and there was a lot of spectators that came out to watch. And when it grounded, it did some damage. So it had to go back in and get repaired. So this is the shipyard in New York Navy Yard, and some of the ship workers actually taking care of the propeller damage, obviously, and also taking care of some of the hull damage that was done, again, on scaffolds strung out and painting the hull. All manual labor. Just overwhelming in the size this wreck is. It's the second largest. The only one really larger than it is the San Diego, which was a battleship, much like the Olympia, which is up in Philadelphia, off the coast of New York. Again, all on a scaffold. It had to be incredibly dangerous work too, because there's no real safety lines there. They're standing on wooden scaffolds and they're painting. This is a happy, looks like a happy iron worker there. He's like, let's get this picture over with. Yeah, they're putting rivets back in the hull. Just the physical labor to build these ships is pretty intense. So John Dudas perished on a dive off the New Jersey coast, and it was overwhelming for the dive community. He was known as the best diver on the coast, and I was on the dive actually, so it still marks one of my saddest moments in my life that I spent in that situation. But this is a picture of John and Evelyn. They're famous for being the first ones to dive the Andrea Doria, or actually the first recreational trip to dive the Andrea Doria in 1967. And John recovered the compass binnacle at that time from the bridge wing. This is 1982. He perished on a wreck called the Virginia off the coast of New Jersey. So 40 years later, 2022, his son, Mike Dudas, who was a child at the time when his father passed away, goes out and recovers the steam whistle from the Northern Pacific. So the tradition goes on, and Mike is an exceptional diver also. This is on the RV Explorer out of Cape May. But wait, there's always something bigger and better, right? Russ Bergeron and Barbara Mortensen recovered the steam whistle, or foghorn, I should say. And that's a foghorn being used in the picture up here. You can see at the time in dock. Immense. This stood in the dive shop, Atlantic Divers, for about 10 years. There were 600 plus portholes on this wreck. So you're going to see some pretty amazing pictures if you're into this type of thing, but this is just like one day of diving. Now, the guy on the left there is Chuck Wine, and this is the 3 portholes that he brought home, but actually he recovered 6 portholes that day. The first 3 that he recovered, he tied off, and when he went out in the sand, or went out off the back of the boat to cut the line and bring them back in, he cut the wrong line. And all 3 of the portholes went down to the bottom somewhere out in the sand. He never found the spot, but on the second dive, I witnessed him actually recovering 3 more. He was an amazing person, about 6'2", 3 or 4, about 270 plus pounds. I saw him break a porthole in half, break a crowbar in half, and tear a 26-pound lobster in half. So he was kind of a monster in diving, but brutally, he was pretty incredible. George Powers and Bob Mindbreeze in the background here, 2 portholes from the Northern Pacific.
Do they all have the glass burned out of them, Gene?
Some of them have come up with glass that is like cracked, and they're really pretty. In fact, the guy at my first dive, he recovered one with glass, and that's all he did was go down and just put one in a bag and send it up. That was our dive. That's a Robin 2 out of Barnegat Light. And there's actually square portholes too. Porthole doesn't necessarily mean it's round, but there's square portholes. I thought this guy was coming tonight. So Brian Romer. And there's Rusty and Terry. And yeah, there's still a lot. They still come up. This is the one wreck you can dive, and if you never got a porthole, if you're a diver, you can see a porthole at least. This is as recently as like 2 years ago, 3 years ago. So now we're on to the Big 7. So I called this the trip the Big 7 because we wanted to go to the most popular wrecks off the coast, and it included all these wrecks that we dive. So I hooked up with a guy named Ray Edel out of Barnegat Light, and he told me he would run his boat down to Cape May. We leave out of Barnegat Light and then run down to Cape May, but there was a strike at the time, and he actually was making some money on the side running strike breakers to go across the Delaware River, and he was fetching big money for that. So when I had this trip scheduled, he said, "Oh, I don't think I want to do that because I'm making too much money." I said, "This is a commitment you made to me, and I'll shut you down." And we actually didn't have that kind of a conversation, but I did threaten that we would have some bad publicity from it. He came over to Cape May, and then I had to arrange a lift to put the compressor on board. I had to get people out of the Seaview bar at 10 o'clock at night because they were socializing and having a good time. And I paid for the boat slip with about 10 lobster when we came back in. It's a picture by Harley Sager, but this is the gun on the gunboat, the Cherokee, that went down in 1918. So this is also, a lot of these shipwrecks that we dive are built locally, built in Camden and built in Philadelphia, New York Shipyard, which is actually located in Philadelphia. And we'll talk about that in a minute, but this boat, this tugboat, was pretty incredible. It could do 10 knots, and it had a 2,850 mile range. So it could cover a great area. So originally it was just a working tug, and then it was commissioned for the Navy in 1917. Of course, there was a big war effort. After April 15th of 1917, we entered the war. We declared war on Germany, so every vessel that was available at the time was put on detail to either help out or to be a part of a navy. They acquired a lot of different vessels for this type of thing. And its final voyage was actually to get some ammunition and to get some guns. And it ended up heading down to Washington, D.C., to the Naval Shipyard in Washington, D.C., except that it didn't make it. That was his final voyage on February 24th. It ran into a full gale, and all the crew members on board went down with the ship at the time. Distress signals were sent out, but nobody was able to avail them of any type of rescue. There's John Dudas and Bart Malone, and we're in a boat called the Miss Shelter Haven, which Don Kramer took out to all these wrecks at the time. Some of these boat captains should get a lot of credit for taking divers out, because this was an unknown sport. They were taking people out that were jumping into the water, going down to 150 feet of depth and coming back up. And, you had to be kind of a character to be able to say, oh, let's do that. That sounds like no problem whatsoever. So this is a memorial in D.C., but all the crew members, 10 sailors out of 38 actually, survived. And again, they were taken into Philadelphia Navy Yard. So the captain, he needed repairs done to this tugboat at the time, but there was such a situation because of the war effort that they did like minimal repairs. So he was blamed for the sinking, even though he was ordered to go out to sea. So basically, in the end, the Navy Commission came up and said there was really no fault in the captain, even though he was at fault because he was the captain, if you can understand that wording. But because of the war effort, he was not at fault. It's just a list of all the lives that were lost on this vessel, and just so that we appreciate what happened to bring us to this point. as Americans, where we are right now, able to just even discuss this. And to give you an idea of the youth that was involved in these sinkings, here's one of the sailors that went down with the ship, Patrick Rowley. So up in the bow, there used to be a gun, and underneath the gun, it was stacked with shells. And in Bart Malone's right hand there is a head of one of the 3-inch shells that was fired. I think it still has some explosives in it, though it needs to be taken apart. And we do have an expert here, if you want to ask Tom Fagan. He can tell you how to do that because he does that kind of thing in his garage. So. So back in the mid-90s, one of the divers that dives with us went out and decided that he wanted to recover the gun. So he got his clam boat out and recovered the gun. That's a huge gun. And this is it coming up to the surface on the back of his boat. And that's the gun. Where's it at? It's at, we looked for it actually. Joni and I went and we tried to find it. Supposedly it's in a VFW in somewhere in South Jersey. But we went to 2 of them, and I think it must be in some other place because I could not find it. And I was unable to get in touch with the diver who recovered it. This is Captain Kramer, and he gets a lot of credit for his family actually running charters. They ran over 100 years of trips. His first trips that they took out were by sail. If you can imagine going out and sailing and fishing, his great-grandfather or his grandfather would take out people on a boat called the Allard, and they would go out and sail to the shipwreck. Now, I spoke to Dennis Bogan, and he told me that the way that they used to find wrecks at the time was all by sight bearing, land, using compass bearings from land, but also when they found a new ship, sometimes they would just look for fish boiling on the surface. There were so many fish at the time that they would look for that, and that was how they found some of these wrecks. So this is the Miss Shelter Haven. John Dudas ran Thursday afternoon trips on the Miss Shelter Haven. He was my presiding instructor when I took my instructor course in 1974, and he invited me. He said, "Hey kid, you look like you know what you're doing. I go out on Thursdays. Anytime you want to go out on Thursdays, I run trips." So I hooked up with John. I started going out on Thursdays with him. On the left-hand side is the original sailboat that Arnold Kramer took out. And then on the right-hand side is the original Captain Kramer, which Pratt Kramer took out, his father. I actually chartered Pratt Kramer back in the 70s, and he had a boat called the Miss Sea Isle through the dive shop in New Jersey, and we chartered his boat. And he ran right out of Sea Isle. He went to 3 wrecks, the Rock Pile, the Dredge, and the Barge Wayne. And one day, Don decided to go out and go on the Dredge, and there was a big fight on the radio, and it was between father and son. Don ended up writing a book about his experiences, and it's interesting because when you read it, it sounds like he's talking to you, and I think he was. I think he was just dictating the whole book, and there's some things that you don't want to read in there, but there's some good stories in there. This is a picture on the bow to one of our trips, probably out to the city of Athens. Big group there, a lot of recognized faces by those people that dive here. Okay, here's number 3 here, the city of Athens. This is a spectacular dive, even today. It's got all kinds of nicknames, which we'll discuss. This is in the New York shipyard, which is in Philadelphia at the time, and it's being built. New York Shipyard Building Company also made over 500 ships, including Jacob Jones, and many Vickers-class types of destroyers. They were called, a lot of them were called Hog Islanders. And this is also interesting for those of you that go to Philadelphia, where you buy a sandwich and you buy a hoagie, because it was originally they were going to take the sandwich to work, and they said, oh, go make them a hoagie for the Hog Islanders, so they made them a hoagie sandwich. Really a lot of woodwork going on there in this shipyard. So it was named the New York Shipbuilding because it was originally supposed to go to Staten Island, but it ended up in Philadelphia. So also it was financed through Andrew Mellon, who was who owned Shell. He owned a bunch of different companies, Mellon Art Gallery down in Washington, D.C., and Henry Frick, who was also a steel entrepreneur. He had all different types of investments in U.S. Steel. And also that it was bought in 1916 by W.R. Grace. Grace is another shipping lines that travels the coast. And we've picked up actually China up in Nova Scotia and Halifax Harbor that had the Grace lines on it as far as their emblems. So a couple of ships, Jacob Jones, which you might recognize, Lemuel Burroughs, the Oklahoma, which split in half off the coast of New Jersey, the Wilkesboro, which is a huge battleship. It's a 14,000-ton battleship that sank, was actually sunk on purpose off of Florida, which is a popular dive down in the Key area. And the Oklahoma, which was sunk in Pearl Harbor. So these ships got all over the world. And imagine it employed 30,000 people in 1967, so until it was closed. So this is a spectacular rendition by a local artist here, and it's really fantastic. Before there was side scan, there was Greg Modell, and Greg Modell is right here tonight. And he's really done some great picture work. He has a photographic memory, and this is so detailed. This is exactly what it looks like on the bottom. So it was in a collision, almost split in half by an armored ship called the La Gloria on May 1st, 1918, just after just before, in the middle of the war, I should say, the first couple weeks of 1918. It's also known as the ammo wreck because we find all this French ammunition on it. This is one of the boilers, massive boiler, and the engine stands up in the center of the wreck. It's huge. It's also called the refrigerator because it's a very cold dive. People go out there and they're expect to dive 110 feet of water and be in a wetsuit, and they find out that this is like a super cold dive, and a wetsuit just is not appropriate for that kind of a dive. Just tons of this French ammunition that comes up. And yes, it is live. You need to be very careful with it when it dries out. I've known a couple different people that have dropped it, and it's fired. I wouldn't recommend you put it in the campfire and sit around and see what happens, because probably it's going to do what it's supposed to do. And also they find rifle butts and bottles and Sloan's liniment, which you cannot forget the smell when somebody brings it up. They crack open a bottle of Sloan's liniment, and everybody knows what that is. It stinks. I think this is an oiler here that Tom Fagan may have recovered.
He got it. He got it.
So Gary Gentile, Tony Vram, who used to be a mate for Eddie Boyle, and Jimmy White recovered the helm from the city of Athens back in the early 70s. And there's a picture of a young Don Kramer there and a young Gary Gentile. This is like a typical scene on the Captain Kramer. Everybody tying off their doubles all the way up the side of the gunnel. There was a doorway up in the front, and that's the sleeping accommodations. I'm in the yellow shirt there in the middle, and that's the Lindell Corio laying next to me, and a bunch of just smothered bodies laying around for a long 2-hour ride out to the wreck. Chuck Cole up there in the bow area. It's a spectacular dive. It's a super wreck. So in 1969, they found the Belle. The Somerset was the name of the original name of the ship, and this is a picture from 1969, June 1st, and that's Jerry Murphy, who also was one of the first offshore deep water female divers. She dove everything. And today we go out, this is the conditions going out to the city of Athens, spectacular dive. We go out with Captain Chuck here, who runs the Blackbeard out of Cape May now. Okay, so the Václav is really an awesome wreck. It's hard to get to, and I've been to it fewer times than I'd like to have gone to. It just seems to be in a position where everybody ends up wanting to go to something else, or we just don't have the weather to get to it all the time. But a great dive. It was torpedoed by the U-94. And the U-94 has a pretty interesting career, but this was a really sweet wreck. Just carrying sugar. It's a picture on a postcard. It sank very quickly. The captain and the first mate got into a life raft, and they were caught by the forward mast here. It pulled the raft underwater, and the mate was able to swim to the surface, and the raft pulled the captain down with it. He got tangled up in the raft and ended up drowning, and the mate swam to another boat and was saved. They brought him into Lewes, so they landed a lifeboat right there in Lewes, Delaware. And again, the 7 sailors were lost, and the remaining crew on top saved. But this is an interesting story because they had this rat on board when they were in the tropics, and they couldn't get rid of this rat, and they called it King Kong, I guess appropriate for the time. And they tried everything. They tried a poison gas. They left all different types of rat poison around. And it seemed to escape every time. And this one sailor was able to get on a piece of slotsam or a board and just hang on to it. And when he swam over to the board, there was a giant rat sitting on top of it. And it was King Kong. And he wasn't going to share the board with the rat, so he turned the board over and the rat swam away. And then when he was picked up, he looked back, and the rat swam back to the piece of board and was standing on top of it. So if you have any rats in Delaware or Cape May, they might be related to King Kong. So. And rats do swim. I looked it up. So his raft was spotted the next day. And this is just kind of proves that this is the Václav. This is a picture taken by Rusty Castaway. And you can see Brian Sullivan there swimming across the stern area, and it matches almost perfectly with the picture. And this is a side scan. Ben Roberts has been doing side scans all along the coast. And now all these pictures that Greg Modell drew, we can verify. They're so accurate. And also he's verifying my experiences as far as, oh yeah, this is exactly the way I remember it when you go down and you see a wreck like this on a side scan.
Gene, can you point out right
people over here?
Greg, yeah, stand up, Greg. I've done more than... There's another piece of artwork in here that Greg did. I asked him for some more, but he's still working on it. So here's a positive proof that it's the Voslev. Of course, Bart didn't get a letter, so he has to make up a letter and plug that into the picture. So this is one of the most successful U-boat commanders at the time. He was able to sink 26 merchant ships and damage one. But the real story is actually when the U-boat was captured, these British, Canadian, I should say, sailors were able to board the U-boat. They jumped on board and they went down into the conning tower, and two German sailors attacked them and they shot them, and then the rest of the German crew surrendered and they were able to capture the entire boat. But the big story is that when they were really kind of unprepared for this submarine to pop to the surface and them to go out and try and get it, they really weren't properly clothed, so they just had like underwear on. And this picture is depicting them with clothes on, but actually when they swam to the boat, they lost their pants. Or at least one of them did. Of course, you don't know who it is, but the commander's on the left, and that's Hal Lawrence. I figured out that was him. So one of the other two guys, Hal Lawrence never made it. One of the other two guys that boarded the boat there, they lost their pants in the attack. But they were decorated for it later on, and I'm sure they were happy about that type of decoration. Okay, so we have the U-857, which did a attack on the New Jersey coast and sank the RP Resor. Now this isn't part of the Big Seven, but this leads to a more dramatic sinking of the Jacob Jones. So the day after the sinking of the RP Resor, the Jacob Jones was sent out from New York to go and patrol off the New Jersey coast and went all the way down to Cape May. And the next day, when it turned around in the midnight hours, it was attacked by the U-857. Of course, it was named after the commander Jacob Jones, who had 5 victories during the War of 1812. So the boat turned around and was attacked by the U-857. It took 2 depth charges, and the ship kind of sank almost immediately. The bow bridge section, actually, where one of the sailors went on board to get a cup of coffee, actually, and some sugar, it was still floating at the time, and he was able to drink a little bit of coffee and then jump into the February 28th degree water, which you can imagine off the coast now, pretty incredibly cold. This is where the 2 torpedoes struck. Now, here's where the story gets interesting. So I got a phone call from this guy, and this is Commander Eric Tidwell. He called me up and he said, I'd like to pay tribute to my grandfather, Joseph Tidwell, the last living survivor of the sinking of the Jacob Jones. And I said, oh, okay, where are you from? He goes, well, I live in Jacksonville, Florida with my family. And I said, where have you dove? And he said, well, I'm open water certified and do a lot of like tropical reef diving. And I said, boy, this is quite a mission that you have. And then he said, I'm a Super Hornet pilot. I said, oh, this is kind of enlightening. And then he said, in fact, I'm the commander of the Pacific Fleet. And I said, oh, this is getting even better. And I said, I might be able to work with you. So he came up and we did some practice dives, we did some training, I got him equipped, and he had the right stuff. He had the right attitude and everything. And we set up a charter with the RV Explorer, and we went out and we were able to pay tribute to his grandfather. This is a picture that Steve Gatto took of me and Eric on his dive and descent to the Jacob Jones. He's standing in front of a depth charge, or a torpedo, excuse me, and he's just pointing out the torpedo. So there's still live ordnance on all these wrecks. And it's not great visibility on the Jacob Jones. It's usually kind of like 15 to 20, and 20 is a good day. There's 3 different sections. I've dove all 3 sections. In the bow section, originally when I dove it, there were all these big wheels from, I guess, the engine room that was up in that area, because it's splattered all over the place. And then there was a big oval or type, like a tent that you swim underneath. And I dove the bridge section one time with Captain Bob Mindbreeze. We found it, and that was the most intact piece that we found. This is a picture of Joe, and this is a tribute for him. This is back in the early 2012, I believe, 2013. Now, he jumped into the water, he swam to a raft, and they weren't picked up until 10 o'clock the next morning. So his legs always had problems throughout his life from being in that cold water for so long. And it was fortunate because he passed away less than 2 years after we did this tribute for him. But what a great experience. You know, stories just get better and better. And I was on the dock talking to Eric, and I said, you're the Pacific Fleet commander, and your granddad is this war hero. And what about your dad, Jim? And he said, well, I'll let you tell that story. And he said, I went over and I said, Jim, what's the story with you? You didn't go into the military? He says, well, going into the military back in like the late 60s, early 70s was kind of not a great idea because of Vietnam. He said, but I'm from Jacksonville, Florida, and you might have heard I played with a band down there called Leonard Skinner. So he wasn't in Leonard Skinner, he was in the 1%, I believe, and he knew those guys. He came back to our house, and my son at the time was into music, and he had drums and a guitar and everything. He played everything in the house, and it was just fantastic. And if these sailors, these 12 sailors, or actually it ended up being 11, did not survive, some really special people in the world would not be around. So this is a story of Augie Storm, and I spoke to his son, and he wanted to come and do a tribute for his father also, but just never made it because he's been so busy. Augie was able to go around and sell savings bonds after the war, and he was pretty much considered a war hero because of what happened on the Jacob Jones. And this is our RJ Storm. This is his son, a picture of dad and son here. And RJ Storm is really incredible. He's a violin maker. He makes banjos, and he made banjos for Pete Seeger and a lot of the other folk artists that continue to play. And this is the picture of him and Pete Seeger over time here. And this is what those gun shells from the Jacob Jones look like. So ordnance, these guys collect all this, and it's kind of like everywhere. And as long as it's cleaned properly, and should I tell a Canadian story, Greg?
Yeah.
So there's propellant inside these shells, and when you pull it out, the guys would throw it into the fire around the campfires up in Nova Scotia, and they would throw it into the fires, and it would make it burn like bright green and whatever. So we had this rainstorm, and everything was soaking wet, and we took some of this propellant and we were throwing it into the fire. And one of the Canadians came by, and he was looking at the fire, and he said, "Where did you guys get your firewood?" And I said, "Well, where did you get your firewood?" He goes, "Well, I got it here from the campground, but it doesn't burn like yours." He says, where'd you get yours? I said, we brought American wood with us. So the UA-57 was bombed at sea and all were lost. Number 4 here, the Moonstone. It's the first wreck that also John Dudas also was the first diver to dive this. He found the bell immediately, which is Lone Star, and positively identified the wreck on his first dive. So that's pretty spectacular. This went down at a collision. A picture by Harley Sager here, just to show you what the gun looks like. So it had some mechanical issues, and it was going into port, and it was in a collision. And it went down fully armed. So I did a dive a couple times with a boat out of Indian River Inlet, a guy named Bill Tattersaw, I should say, and I tied in. And this was actually one of my most best dives ever, but the way it started out really wasn't the best dive ever because the anchor was hooked into depth charges in the stern. And I thought, gee, you know, this is kind of tricky. I'm not really sure what I should do here. So I kind of like popped it out and moved up to the center part of the wreckage and tied in. That day we had dove a wreck called the Terror Wreck, and I found 3 portholes on the Terror Wreck, plus like 2 lobsters, probably over 10 or 12 pounds. And I was with a group of divers that I never dove before. I was on one of Mike Boring's trips, and first dive I come up with 3 portholes, and I wouldn't have known there was one there because there was one stuck in my foot, and this guy named Bob Miller came along, and he thought he was undoing my foot, and there was a porthole dangling in my fin. So I grabbed that too. I gave it to Bob later. Then we went to the Moonstone, and I swam out in the sand, and I found a couple more like 10-pound lobsters plus, and I found one of these Moonstone windows. But this is Bill Tattersaw coming up the ladder here, and he took us out quite a bit on a boat named after his dog, Mr. Ike. There's a depth charge laying on top of the wreck there. They were more intact. If you go there now, they look like a big salt lick, but actually you can see the resemblance of this depth charge there on the bottom. And a diver nuzzled next to it there, kind of like looking at it, but not looking too hard. So I reached inside and I found this pitcher and pulled out this cigarette lighter inside the pitcher. This was on display for a while in the museum here. I figured it must be the cook's, cigarettes. Because on another wreck that we dived called the Eureka, I found a bowl and I found a pipe in it. And that had to be in the kitchen. So this had to be the cook's cigarettes that he had stashed in the bowl before it sank. So I'm making this up, but it sounds pretty fair there. I found a couple of these windows laying out in the sand on that dive. So I got 3 portholes from the Terror Wreck, and then 2 of these windows from the Moonstone, and then 4 lobsters over 10 pounds. I remember I got back to the dock. Remember, nobody knew who I was, and I heard a couple guys talking to Mike saying, "Who the blank is that guy?" Of course, they weren't saying blank. Up in the bow area, you found these little uniforms, and they were like tiny. I don't know if they shrank or whatever, or the sailors were really small, but they looked like child size. You had to be like 110 pounds, and I guess people were smaller back then, but they were really small. I'm telling you, these they shrank. And there's some of the china. And here's this guy here. He's always finding something. That's Tom Fagan here sitting up in the front. Again, another Ben Roberts picture of what the Moonstone looks like.
Which is the bow, which is the stern?
The bow's on your, actually I think I got it reversed. The bow's on your right, and the stern's broken up. And I think the depth charges are right in this area right here, right in there. So this guy found so many wrecks. I got to give him credit. He passed away a few years ago. He was the first boat to go off and actually side scan offshore. And some of the wrecks that he found include the Carolina, the Texel, the City of Athens, which he named after the distance it took him from Atlantic City to get there. So 26 miles south, 28 miles south, and that's how he named some of these wrecks. So it's pretty fantastic that he went out and did all this and found all these. He was pretty tight with his numbers, and I got to know him in a couple different ways, but I would always call up if I had a new number and we were going to go 60 or 70 miles offshore, and I would say, Andy, you don't have to tell me the number, you just have to tell me if this is a good number. So I would read the number to him, and I could always tell if it was a good number because he started cussing. This is a fantastic dive. Varinger is another one of the big wrecks off the coast. This is a tanker torpedoed by the U-130. It's 28 miles. It's one of the Andy Applegate wrecks, 28 miles south of Atlantic City. So the U-130, again, was in part of Operation Drumbeat, which they sent U-boats off the coast to stop all the merchant ships from supplying the Brits during World War II. So this guy fired a couple torpedoes. The first torpedo struck in the stern section, and this picture is depicted by Chuck Samaro here. And this is originally, when I first dove it, this is what it looked like. The stack was actually on it back in the 70s. You could swim down from the top of the stern wheelhouse area and wind yourself down the stairs and go all the way down to the bottom and actually come out the cut. And really, really a cool dive. Really stands high. Even today off the bottom, stands at about 110, or I think about 120 feet of water. But back then it was almost up to like 90 feet. And that's the bow. This is the next morning, the picture of the bow sticking out of the water. 6:30 a.m., and if you look closely, you can see the letters that says Varinger. I've been up to the bow, and I've looked, and I've never been able to find those letters. But some other people have been up there, and they've found some pretty cool things, which I'll show you. This was one of the most successful U-boat captains also. After sinking the Varinger, he sank 10 more ships. 145,000 plus tons of shipping sank. And he survived the war. He was on 5, this was kind of unfathomable for a U-boat to go and for a captain to survive 5 different engagements and to go out to sea 5 different times and come back. So in a storm in 1990, the stern deck gun, which used to be a part of the stern, you could actually swim up to it and swim around it. And one of the guys found a gun plug that has a star on it. I was diving with, and it was really cool. But after the storm, the ship started to deteriorate, and the weight of the barrel was just too great, and it kind of just plummeted over the stern and went straight down and stuck in the mud. So I got called up by this group from National Geographic, and they wanted to go out and film the Varinger. They wanted to see something that was really cool. And I talked to him, and Gary Gentile and I talked to him and said, hey, you should film the stern. There's a gun there. It's really spectacular. Well, we got there, and the whole back was opened up like a can opener. It had torn off the top, and the barrel stuck down in the sand. And there's one of the things that we found laying loose after it opened up the bottom. So this is Nick Calianis, Brian Scarry, Gary Gentile, and Lynn Del Corio on the dive here with Bob Mindbreeze's boat. It was a long day. One of the interesting things is that Nick Calianis brought, I think, like 7 Aquadyne cameras with him which was 16 or millimeter film at the time, and it was, they were like all in coolers. There was no room on the boat to move around. There was $1 million worth of camera gear on the boat. And I was so excited. I was waiting to see this film that they made called The Enemy Off Our Coast. And it was on National Geographic. And the segment for New Jersey was almost 34 seconds. Because the stern ripped apart, Linda Ocoria and I swam to the back to tie into the stern to show him the gun, which was never there. But here was the compass binnacle that was laying loose underneath. This is the auxiliary compass binnacle in the stern. So we put a lift bag on it and sent it up. And Brian Scarry is a really famous, I almost said infamous, but famous National Geographic photographer. He's filmed whales, the journey of whales. If you look on National Geographic, spectacular story about that. But he said, is that our descent line? And I said, no, I don't think so. It's a compass binnacle. First dive, we go down and get this compass binnacle. So about a year later, or 2 years later, went out with this other group, and Lynn and I found a bridge telegraph off the in the same area. So this was just in Naui magazine. They had this issue by Jerry Murphy back in the early 70s. She recovered another bridge telegraph. Really cool. I mean, it's exactly the same thing I have. I tried to communicate with her, but she has not answered me back yet. So everybody survived. They went into Sea Isle City, which made Sea Isle famous for a couple hours. And they went to the Catholic Church, which is still there. Went by, took a picture. The church is still there on Landis Avenue if you want to go by and see. And actually, the captain of the Varinger ended up investing in property in Sea Isle and supposedly owned a hotel there for a while. The only loss of life were the 2 dachshunds that went down with the ship. These are some pictures by Rusty Cathaway. Too bad the light's on there. I should have asked you to turn the light off, but.
If I do that, everything's going to go off.
Yeah, I think probably. And this is the engine, which are still intact, and you can swim through. Steve Gatto with a scooter. So some other really great divers have dove these wrecks first, way before we even thought about doing it. And it's the grandfather of diving, Mike DeCamp here, and he's got a plaque from the Varinger. I was able to dive with Mike a few times, and he always liked to pose, so I got these great pictures of him diving on the RP Resort, making an ascent. We had really great visibility, and I have a picture of him about 50 feet down the line, and he's coming up. This is Tommy Roach on the left, also with another plaque. There's George Hoffman with a gigantic lobster from one of the big 7, and of course, one of the best wreck divers probably in the world, Gary Gentile on the far right.
What's that pipe sticking up?
There's a young Gary and a young Tom Roach. They led EDA, Eastern Dive Boat Association, which was the premier to all this deeper diving, which at the time, it wasn't labeled technical diving, it was just labeled wreck diving. So I call it wrecknical diving. And another guy here, which took us all over, Bob Archibald. I had a trip with Bob one time, and he wrote the numbers that we were going to backwards. So we ended up about 50 miles away from the proper destination. And he said the next morning I could tie in. I didn't have to tie in the dark that night. So the next morning they searched around, and his captain partner at the time, John Slotnick, said, "Can you show me those numbers again?" And I gave him the numbers again. And he looked at them and he saw the last two numbers were transposed. And he said, we're 50 blank miles away from the wreck that we should be. And we're 50, 50 miles away from the wreck. We were out in the middle of the ocean in like 300 feet of water. Anyhow, he got it right. We ended up diving some other wrecks. Here's a young Bob on the right there on the Sea Lion with Tommy Roach. These guys found out the hard way that the bunker oil just does not go away. It still stays there. It floats underneath. If you go underneath the wreck and you reach up, there's some mud-like, which is actually oil, bunker oil, that's been captured by its positive buoyancy above. And they got all in it and got it really messed up. A couple wrecks that I dove over the years, the Coimbra was also loaded with that. We had divers take their suits off in the water before they came on the boat. These two guys are soaping it up. Some of the things recovered from the Varinger. And today, this is more what it looks like, another depiction by Greg Modell. It's flattened out. It's not as high as it used to be. The stack is obviously gone or rusted away. And a couple portholes come up. And then there's Joe Milligan. Joe Milligan is a Cape May artist, good friend. I've known him for years, dive partner with Bart Malone. And he got probably one of the most special things up in the bow area. He recovered the bell. For years, we were spelling Varinger the wrong way. Does it have one R or two R's? Well, he confirmed that there's only one R in Varinger. And he also sells his artwork down in Cape May. If you want to drop into his art studio, it's pretty fantastic. He does some really great work. And there's the bell. And it's one R. Remember, we didn't have internet back then, so we had to hope that they spelled it right. So if you can't read that, life is not measured by the breaths we take, but by the moments that take our breath away. And that's by George Carlin. And this is dedicated to all my friends that I've known and have passed away. And everybody gets credit for their pictures too, including Greg Modell. And that means that's all I got in Swedish.